Sometimes history doesn't turn on a fleet, a grand strategy, or a famous ace. Sometimes it turns on a single mechanical break, small enough to fit in the length of a hand, but decisive enough to change how an entire war is fought. This story begins with a bullet that didn't do what bullets are expected to do. It didn't hit the pilot. It didn't puncture the fuel tanks. It didn't trigger a fireball. Instead, it cut one line, an oil return line running between the oil cooler and the engine. That sounds minor until you understand what oil is in an air-cooled radial engine. It's not just lubrication, it's survival. Oil pressure is the thin boundary between controlled motion and irreversible seizure. Once that pressure starts to collapse, the engine is still running, but it's already dying. Every second becomes a countdown written in temperature, friction, and metal. And that's why this case matters. A slow mechanical failure forced a pilot into a binary choice in the sky. One decision made under stress, in bad terrain, with minutes of engine life left. That decision didn't just determine the end of one aircraft, it set off a chain of events that delivered Japan's most guarded fighter design into American hands, intact enough to be studied, tested, and turned into tactics. One severed oil line didn't win the Pacific by itself, but it helped rewrite the rules of how the Pacific would be fought. On June 4, 1942, a Mitsubishi Zero was operating over Dutch Harbor, Alaska, when it took a hit from defensive fire. This wasn't the kind of strike that instantly tears an aircraft apart. It didn't explode a fuel tank. It didn't drop the pilot. It didn't even look like the obvious kill shot you'd expect. But the damage was precise and deadly. According to your text, the bullet severed the return oil line, the line running between the oil cooler and the engine. That single cut turned a combat aircraft into a machine living on borrowed minutes. The oil was no longer circulating the way it had to. Pressure would fall, temperature would climb, and the engine's internal parts, built to survive only when separated by a thin film of oil, would begin moving toward inevitable seizure. The pilot was 19-year-old Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. In that moment, the problem was no longer tactical positioning or enemy fire, it was systems failure, a mechanical countdown that can't be negotiated with skill alone. From there, the entire event becomes a chain reaction, one small break in a fluid line forcing a decision in the sky. Because once the oil starts draining, the aircraft doesn't get to keep fighting, it gets to choose where it will stop. A severed oil line creates a very specific kind of emergency, not instant destruction, but a slow, irreversible failure. In your text, the mechanism is straightforward and brutal. Oil isn't optional, it's the barrier that keeps metal from grinding metal inside a running engine. Once the return line is cut, the system can no longer maintain normal oil pressure. The engine may keep producing power for a short time, but the conditions inside it are already shifting in one direction only: rising heat, rising friction, falling protection. The aircraft's engine is described as a 14-cylinder Nakajima. With oil pressure collapsing, the engine is expected to seize within minutes. Seize isn't a gentle shutdown, it's an internal lockup. Parts expanding from heat, surfaces scuffing, bearings starving, tolerances disappearing. The rotating mass fights itself until it can't rotate anymore. That's why this kind of hit is so dangerous psychologically. The pilot still hears the engine running, the aircraft still flies. It tempts you to believe you have time, but the failure isn't a possibility, it's a countdown. You are not deciding if the engine will quit, you are deciding where it will quit. And over cold water, fog, and remote terrain, where is the difference between a controlled landing and a disappearance? With the oil draining and the clock running, the situation narrowed to a choice that wasn't emotional or heroic, it was mechanical. The pilot was 19-year-old Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. According to your text, the severed oil line forced him into a binary decision dictated by fluid dynamics. The engine was going to fail soon, and his only control was where that failure would happen. He had two options. Option 1, climb and try to make it back to his carrier. But that route carried a lethal certainty. The flight would likely end with engine seizure over the freezing Bering Sea, a place where an engine-out outcome becomes something far worse than a landing problem. Option 2, divert to the designated emergency landing point, about 25 miles to the east. That meant turning away from the safest idea in theory, getting back to friendly support at sea, and choosing the safest outcome in physics, reach land while the engine still had a few minutes left. Koga chose the diversion. He turned his aircraft, identified in your text as DI-108, toward Akutan Island. And that single turn is where this story really begins, because it wasn't just a navigation change. It was the first step in a chain of events that would end with the Imperial Navy's most protected fighter design lying intact in a place where the United States could recover it. Koga's decision to divert wasn't just turn toward land. It was a commitment to a very specific plan. Reach the designated emergency landing area before the engine's countdown reached 0. With the oil system compromised, the aircraft's future was no longer open-ended. Every minute in the air was borrowed time, and the goal became simple: get the Zero onto the ground while it could still be controlled. So he aimed for Akutan Island. As your text describes it, the environment below was already setting a trap, a deceptive mix of volcanic terrain and living ground that looks safe from above but behaves like a fluid under load. Still, from the cockpit, the logic of the diversion is clear. Water offers no second chances. Land, even uncertain land, offers at least the possibility of a survivable touchdown. The Zero arrived over Akutan, trailing oil, a visible sign that the failure was active and worsening. And then, Koga committed to the landing site itself, approaching a broad valley that appeared to be exactly what a pilot in an emergency wants to see: a flat, green expanse nestled between volcanic slopes. This is the moment where the story pivots from aircraft damaged in combat to aircraft about to become a captured artifact. Because once he chose Akutan, the next outcomes would be decided by three things your text keeps returning to: what the terrain looked like from the air, what it actually was under the wheels, and what a pilot chose to do with his landing gear when he couldn't be sure. From the air, the valley looked like the answer. Your text describes Koga coming in over a broad, flat expanse of green terrain, an open area tucked between volcanic slopes. At around 500 feet, the surface read like solid, manicured grass, the kind of ground a pilot imagines he can roll across, slow down on, and stop without tearing the aircraft apart. But that was the illusion. The valley floor wasn't firm earth. It was muskeg, a green skin from altitude in a biological trap under load. Muskeg is not simply mud. In your text, it's defined as a deep accumulation of decaying vegetation, sphagnum moss, and water-saturated soil built up over centuries. It can look stable because the top layer supports its own shape, but it cannot support a concentrated point load like an aircraft tire. So the danger here wasn't obvious rocks or steep terrain. It was misreading the surface. To a pilot under pressure, seconds from an engine failure, the eyes want to believe the green is safe. The landing zone appears wide, it appears flat, it appears forgiving. But the physics are opposite. The moment weight comes onto the wheels, the surface stops being ground and starts behaving like a high-viscosity fluid, soft enough to swallow tires, strong enough to stop them dead. And that's why this block matters. The fatal event doesn't begin at touchdown. It begins earlier, at 500 feet, when the valley lies convincingly enough to make a procedural decision feel safe. In uncertain terrain, procedure exists for a reason. It turns fear into a checklist. Your text explains the logic clearly. If a pilot can't trust the surface, if there's any doubt about whether the ground will support wheels, the safer choice is often a belly landing. By retracting the landing gear, the aircraft increases the area that contacts the ground. Instead of two small tire patches taking the entire load, the fuselage and wings can slide, spreading the forces and bleeding speed through friction. It's rough on the underside of the aircraft and it can destroy the propeller, but it often gives the pilot a better chance of walking away. Koga did the opposite. He kept the landing gear down. That single procedural choice set the geometry of the crash. Your text suggests a reason that fits the situation. He may have believed the valley floor was firm enough for a conventional rollout, and he may have wanted to save the aircraft, possibly with the expectation it could later be recovered by Japanese submarine crews. But the risk of that choice was absolute. Wheels only help if they roll. If they don't roll, if they bite, dig, or lock, then the landing gear becomes a trap. It concentrates the entire energy of the touchdown into 2 points, and it turns forward speed into a violent pivot. So the mistake here isn't framed as carelessness. It's framed as a decision made under stress, based on a visual reading of terrain that turned out to be wrong. Gear down was an attempt to preserve the airplane. In muskeg, it becomes the move that guarantees the airplane will flip and that the pilot will take the impact directly. The touchdown wasn't a gradual loss of speed, it was an instant trap. Your description describes the moment the main wheels touched the green surface. They did not roll. Instead, they cut through the vegetation layer and locked into the heavy mud beneath. That single behavior, rolling versus locking, is the difference between a survivable rollout and a catastrophic flip. With the tires immobilized, the landing gear became a rigid anchor point, and now the physics had only one direction to go. The aircraft still had forward momentum. The Zero weighed thousands of pounds, and that mass doesn't stop just because the wheels stop. When the gear legs jammed into muskeg, the wheels turned into a fulcrum, and the entire airframe became a lever. The center of mass was high and forward relative to the wheel contact points, so instead of sliding and dissipating energy along the ground, the aircraft converted its forward motion into rotational torque. In other words, the airplane didn't slow down, it began to rotate. That's why this type of terrain is so deceptive. From above, it looks like a runway. Under wheels, it behaves like a low wall made of mud, soft enough to swallow tires, but strong enough to stop them dead. The moment the wheels locked, the outcome was no longer about pilot skill. It became pure mechanics, momentum, leverage, and a pivot point that guarantees a rollover. Once the wheels locked, the crash didn't spread out across distance. It collapsed into a single violent rotation. Your text describes what happens next as almost instantaneous. The aircraft pivots around the immobilized landing gear and flips upside down in a fraction of a second. The tail lifts, the entire machine rotates through the air, and the landing becomes a rollover instead of a slide. That detail matters because it explains the cruel paradox at the center of this case. The airplane can remain largely intact while the pilot does not. As the Zero rotated, the vertical stabilizer was driven into the mud. The cockpit canopy slammed down into the bog, shattering the plexiglass and forcing the structure into the soft ground. The energy wasn't absorbed by a long skid. It was absorbed by the airframe flipping, by the sudden deceleration spike and the way a human body reacts to it. In your text, the fatal mechanism is blunt. Tadayoshi Koga was killed on impact, his neck breaking during the rollover. The aircraft's structure is rigid and continuous. A strapped-in pilot's torso can be held in place, but the head and neck are vulnerable to the whip of sudden rotation and stop. So the flip becomes the key moment where preservation and death happen together. The aircraft ends up inverted but mostly intact, not shattered across the valley. The same instant that leaves the machine recoverable delivers the fatal load to the pilot. It's not that the plane barely crashed. It crashed in the one way that can preserve aluminum while still being lethal to the person inside. A fast, hard overturn in a surface that doesn't let the wheels release. The outcome looks like a contradiction. A crash violent enough to kill the pilot, yet gentle enough, mechanically, to preserve the aircraft. Your text explains why. The Zero came to rest inverted, but mostly intact. The fuselage did not buckle, the fuel tanks did not rupture, and crucially, the crash never crossed into the one outcome that destroys everything: fire. Part of that is timing and systems. The engine was already compromised by oil loss, meaning it was moving toward failure rather than full power chaos, and the environment the aircraft fell into wasn't dry ground. It was a wet, semi-liquid bog. That bog did something unexpected. It cushioned the machine. Instead of resisting like concrete, sand, or hard soil, the muskeg displaced and molded around the airframe. It spread impact loads across a larger surface area. It reduced the sharp localized stress that snaps spars and folds fuselage frames. The same surface that locked the wheels and caused the flip then softened the final slam, preventing the kind of structural collapse you'd normally expect from an inverted impact. In your text, the preservation is described as accidental and total. The mud acted like a trap and a shock absorber at the same time. It stopped the wheels instantly and initiated the rollover. Then it absorbed and distributed energy as the aircraft hit upside down. So the bog becomes the most important object in the story, not just terrain, an active mechanical participant. It killed the pilot by forcing a violent rotation, but it saved the aircraft by preventing breakup, preventing fire, and holding the airframe in a kind of cold, wet stasis, intact enough to become a time capsule. The central brutality of this case is that the terrain helps the aircraft and destroys the pilot in the same motion. Your text makes the distinction simple. An airplane is rigid, a human body is not. When the landing gear locked in the muskeg, the aircraft's forward momentum didn't bleed off through a long slide. It converted into a rapid rollover. That rollover produces a sharp deceleration spike, an instant where the aircraft structure can survive because loads are spread through frames, skins, and spars, while the person inside takes the event through joints and soft tissue. As the Zero flipped, the canopy struck the bog and drove the aircraft partially down into the wet ground. The cockpit space became a crushing, compressive zone. The pilot was strapped in, which holds the torso to the seat, but the head is still free to move relative to the body. In your text, that mismatch is the fatal mechanism. The whiplash effect snaps the neck during the rollover. Then, the environment finishes what physics started. Your text states that the mud filled the cockpit instantly, removing any possibility of survival if the trauma had not already been fatal. The same soft medium that molded around the wings and fuselage also invaded the cockpit volume. What cushioned aluminum became a suffocating mass for a human. So the mechanism is one chain with two opposite outcomes. For the machine, the bog displaces, distributes forces, and prevents catastrophic breakup. For the pilot, the rapid rotation and sudden stop create lethal neck loads, and the cockpit becomes a space the mud can flood. That's why the phrase from your text lands so hard. The mechanism that saved the machine was the exact mechanism that killed the operator. After the crash, the Zero was still a secret, possibly the most important kind of secret. A whole enemy aircraft that could be studied if someone got to it first. Your text describes what happened next as a procedural test the wingmen failed to execute. Two other Zero fighters circled the crash site. Their standing orders were clear. If a Zero lands in enemy territory and cannot be recovered, it must be destroyed to protect its design secrets. The standard method was direct and final. Strafe the wreck until it burns. But the scene below created a psychological and practical constraint. From above, they saw the aircraft inverted. They saw no movement, but they couldn't verify whether Koga was dead or merely unconscious. And that uncertainty changed everything. The decision they faced wasn't just tactical, it was personal. Without confirmation of death, they could not bring themselves to fire on their flight leader. So they made the choice that feels human, even if it was strategically catastrophic. They circled, hesitated, and then departed, leaving the airframe whole. They assumed the location would protect the secret, the remoteness, the masking terrain, the idea that the wreck would stay hidden and unrecoverable. In their minds, the bog and distance acted like a natural security system. Your text makes the point sharply. They were wrong. That moment, two wingmen deciding not to destroy an intact Zero becomes the final link in the chain of preservation. The crash preserved the aircraft mechanically, but this decision preserved it strategically. Without that hesitation, there is no recovered Zero, no flight testing, and no tactical manual rewritten from enemy data. After the rollover, the Zero didn't just crash, it effectively disappeared into the landscape. Your text explains that the wreck came to rest about 0.5 miles inland from the shoreline. That distance matters because it puts the aircraft out of casual sightlines. It wasn't sitting on a beach where anyone passing by would spot it. It was tucked into a valley environment where small changes in elevation and vegetation can hide even a full aircraft. Then the terrain did what muskeg terrain does. It masked. The valley was covered in tall marsh grass. Your text notes growth up to 3 feet high, and that growth immediately broke up the outline of the inverted fighter. From the air, the Zero's camouflage blended with the green-brown texture of the bog. From the sea, the wreck was shielded by the slight rise of the valley floor. In other words, the aircraft ended up in a pocket where it was hard to see from every angle that normally matters. And it didn't stay on top of the surface. Your text describes the wreck beginning to settle. The heavy engine block pulled the nose down toward the water table, sinking deeper into the saturated ground. Over time, that means the aircraft isn't just hidden by grass, it becomes physically more embedded, lowering its profile and reducing the chance of accidental discovery. The bog also created a chemically distinct environment. The water was cold and likely low in oxygen due to decaying vegetation, which your text says slowed the immediate onset of heavy corrosion. So the Zero wasn't only concealed, it was also preserved in a kind of cold, wet stasis. That's why time capsule isn't a metaphor here. It was a real mechanical outcome, masked by grass and terrain, blended by camouflage, lowered as it settled, and stabilized by an environment that slowed decay. The aircraft held valuable answers inside it, but it sat in a place where people couldn't drive, couldn't easily walk, and often couldn't even see, locked away by geography, until a brief break in the clouds finally exposed it. The discovery of the Akutan Zero is often described like pure luck. But in your text, it reads more like a chain reaction caused by one overwhelming variable in the Aleutians: visibility. On July 10, 1942, a PBY Catalina commanded by William Thies was returning to Dutch Harbor after a standard patrol. He wasn't flying a search grid, he was on a transit leg, just trying to get back home through weather that can erase the world in minutes. In 1942, the primary sensor was the human eye, but fog breaks the logic of searching. If the ceiling drops below about 500 feet, the search box collapses. You can't scan the surface if you can't see the surface. Your text says Thies lost reliable visual reference as shifting wind disrupted his dead reckoning track. To correct position, he needed something hard and undeniable, a coastline, a peak, any landmark. That procedural need forced a deviation. He dropped altitude over Akutan Island, looking for a reset point. Then the key moment. The aircraft passed through a temporary break in the cloud layer, described not as clear sky, but a narrow vertical tunnel in the overcast. Looking down through that window, Feast saw a disturbance in the valley's green texture, a man-made geometry that didn't match the bog's natural pattern. It was the Zero, lying inverted. And here's the irony your text highlights. If the aircraft had landed right side up, its dark upper camouflage might have blended into the terrain for a very long time. But because it was flipped, the red hinomaru insignia on the underside of the wings stood out against the green muskeg like high-contrast beacons. Feast circled to verify what he was seeing. A single-engine fighter, belly up, no smoke, no movement. The position was about 25 miles from Dutch Harbor, close enough to matter, close enough to be recoverable. They couldn't land the heavy flying boat in the marsh, so they did what mattered most in that moment. They documented it. Photographs to prove the find, marked coordinates to lock it to a map, and then a return to base, carrying the information that turned a hidden wreck into a confirmed target. Once the Zero was confirmed, the problem stopped being discovery and became something harder: extraction. The aircraft wasn't on a runway or a beach. It was trapped in muskeg, terrain that couldn't support vehicles, cranes, or normal recovery equipment. Your text frames it as a geometry problem. They needed to lift a roughly 5,000 to 5,500 pound inverted fighter out of a suction trap without bending the fuselage or snapping the wing spars. And they couldn't simply roll it over while it was still embedded, because that would crush the tail and destroy the structure they wanted to study. Step 1. Clear the cockpit. The first handling step was removing the pilot. The canopy area had been driven deep into the muskeg, leaving almost no clearance. Standard access wasn't possible. The job fell to machinists mate Albert Knack, chosen because he was physically small enough to fit into the narrow crush space. He crawled into the inverted cockpit, cut the harness, attached a line, and the team extracted the remains. The pilot was buried nearby, clearing the airframe for technical recovery. Step 2. Lift, and the ground fights back. Next came the attempt to lift the aircraft using a wooden tripod derrick with a block and tackle system. Tripod geometry normally works because the load becomes compressive force down the legs, but muskeg can support concentrated point loads. As the team hoisted, the tripod legs sank 3 to 4 feet into the waterlogged soil. They had to stop, reset, and reinforce the bases to increase surface area and reduce ground pressure, an iterative fight against soil mechanics. Slowly, the fuselage broke free from the vacuum suction of the bog. Step 3. Move without wheels. Slide it. Even after lifting, the aircraft was still about half a mile from the shoreline. Wheeled transport was impossible. Wheels would cut through the surface mat and sink, causing shock loads that could fracture structure. So they rejected rolling motion and used skid transport, a flat-bottomed wooden sled that spreads the aircraft's weight across a large area, dropping pressure below the soil failure threshold. The mud that trapped wheels becomes a lubricant for the sled. They lowered the aircraft onto the skid, secured it, and dragged it toward the ocean. Step 4. Ship, disguise, and preserve chain of custody. At the beach, the Zero is loaded onto a barge and transferred to a ship. Your text names it the USS St. Mihiel. From that point, it became a counterintelligence operation. This wasn't damaged equipment, it was the highest value technical asset of the theater. To prevent unauthorized observation and photography, the aircraft was disguised, covered, and hidden during transport. The goal was to deliver it to engineers with the cockpit, gauges, and controls as close as possible to as found. Your text then gives a clear movement timeline. Shipped south to Seattle, arriving August 1st, then moved by barge to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Step 5. The pivot. From salvage to weaponized data. At North Island, the U.S. Navy didn't just study the Zero, they made it flyable and turned reputation into measurements. Your text identifies Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders running systematic flight tests that revealed hard limits. Aileron freeze above 200 knots. At high speed, roll control stiffened and became slow and heavy. The Zero's famous low-speed agility did not translate into high-speed rolling performance. Fuel system weakness under negative acceleration. The engine used a float-style carburetor, and under negative G, it could sputter or cut out until positive G returned. Those findings were converted into procedure and disseminated. Don't dogfight a Zero at low speed. Keep energy high. If a Zero is on your tail, don't climb, push into a steep dive. Use high-speed rolling maneuvers the Zero can't match once the ailerons stiffen. The mystery became a physics equation pilots could exploit. The final irony: your text ends the aircraft's story with an almost cruel twist. The aircraft survived muskeg, recovery, shipping, and testing. Then in February 1945, it was destroyed on the ground when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control while taxiing, and its propellers struck the Zero, shredding it. The wreck was ordered scrapped. But one last thread survived. William Leonard, a naval aviator who had fought Zeros, salvaged the instrument panel gauges and kept them for decades before donating them to the National Museum of the United States Navy. And that brings the case to its core meaning, exactly as your text frames it. Koga died because of a fatal terrain read and a gear-down decision, but the undamaged aircraft and the data extracted from it helped shape tactics that protected countless Allied pilots across the Pacific.